The conflict in Ukraine worsens with more Russian attacks and hundreds of thousands flee the country. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Ukraine remains under attack with fears that its conflict with Russia is about to get worse. Hundreds of civilians have been killed so far, and a major Russian convoy is poised to move to the capital, Kyiv. Meanwhile, close to 1 million Ukrainians have now fled the country. And the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly on Wednesday to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. Here is what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had to say.
The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now. Silence the guns now. Open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected in line with the UN Charter. But as bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much, much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb.
Joining us now from Lviv in the western part of Ukraine is Yulia Mendel. She is a journalist and former press secretary to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. With us too from New York is Alexander Motil. He is a professor of political science at Rutgers University. His area of expertise is Ukraine and Russia. Also joining the discussion from Rhode Island is Vladimir Goldstein. He is chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University and a commentator on Russian foreign policy. And with us too from Beijing is Victor Ga. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Welcome to all of you. Yulia Mendel, let me start with you. You left Kyiv. You are now in Lviv. What can you tell us about the situation in the country?
Well, thank you for having me here. The situation in the country is quite difficult already for the last week. On the first day of invasion, Russia targeted 16 Ukrainian regions from 25, and 3 of them were in the far west, which means that Russia showed that it can target with bombing and shelling every region of the country. The heaviest situation is, of course, in the south, east, north, and center of the country. I've heard you were saying correct information about the threat that is near Kyiv today, and the latest information that we heard, there was a huge explosion in the center of the city, not far from the railway station. That was the missile that was shot by Ukrainian army, and this missile was targeting Ukrainian defense ministry. One of the hardest situations is in the south. There is a region, Kherson region. This is the region that is bordering Crimea that Russia annexed 8 years ago, and this is my native hometown. So there are a lot of small towns which are captured there. Russia wants to have water supply to Crimea from there. And this is exactly what reminds me Mein Kampf story, so the major story of Hitler, when he was justifying war to have more supplies to the people that he was going to unify. This is the same action when Russia annexed Crimea, and now it's looking for justification of war to killing civilians and getting the territories of other countries to supply water there. The east is having heavily bombing, and there are huge fights in the north of the country. But in fact, the situation is changing all the time. Up to now, you mentioned that there are hundreds of victims, but up to today, there were over 2,000 of civilians who died in this war. Russia is targeting schools, kindergartens, hospitals, and even if I'm in a relatively safe territory in the west of the country, we have air alerts all the time, so we need to act appropriately. We have bomber shelters here, and we switch off the light, and we are looking in the sky, seeing all the war aircraft above. We have checkpoints all over the country. We have military techniques moving in the country, and this all doesn't allow us to forget that the war is very near, is very approaching,
Right.
and of course everyone is working to help the country. The country is very much unified, and we appreciate that we have the leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky these days. He shows quite a good sample, and he earned a huge respect all over the country for his actions.
Right, you know the president, of course, you were his press secretary at one time. Let's listen to his latest message to the Ukrainian people.
We've hardly slept for 7 nights. Or we sleep, but anxiously. My dears, the time will come when we'll be able to sleep, but it'll be after the war, after the victory, in a peaceful country, as we need.
So, Yulia, what can you tell us about this president's resolve to continue this fight against the Russians?
This is an interesting question. I'm not sure it's formulated correctly, because we are not fighting against Russians. We are defending our country. We are not on Russian territory, and we are not on territory of any other country. We're just staying in our home, living peaceful life in our homes, towns, villages, and cities. And there are around 175 Russians who just entered our country from different parts and killing our people, invading the territories, destroying infrastructure, and demanding to change our ideology and to change our probably government, because it was mentioned by many officials from Russia. So we are not fighting Russians, we are defending our country here, and we actually are open to negotiations. Volodymyr Zelensky was the first to appeal to Russia, saying that we need negotiations, and today is the day when the second round of negotiation needed to start. We don't know if it has started or it was postponed till early morning, but we know definitely that Russia offered it to have on Belarusian territory, and there is one place which has a lot of historical memory to Ukrainians. It's called Belaverskaya Pushta, and this is the place where actually Ukraine quit its nuclear potential back in 1994, and now Russia invited Ukrainian delegation to sign probably something or to negotiate something back at the same place. So it has been changed.
All right, Vladimir Goldstein, if the United Nations General Assembly vote is any indication of what the world thinks about what is going on now, it looks like Russia is increasingly isolated. It's also facing very harsh sanctions. Where do you think President Putin is going with this? What are his options right now at this stage of this conflict?
Well, my reading of the situation that you want to call it push to the wall or desperate or decisive, but if he went so far and incurred so much kind of anger from the West, from everyone, he is certain to finish the job. And this is very serious. In other words, it's everybody can say UN or whatever, stop, back off. I don't think Putin is going to back off. There is a resolve to solve this issue, and the issue is Russian security. And we have to. It's not just about Ukraine. It's more or less it's about the United States and Russia, and the United States pushing NATO further and further toward Russia. So Russians complain. Now they resolve. It's very unfortunate. It's tragic that this resolve is done at the expense of civilians. But I think what is very important to stress is I don't think Russia is going to back off. They put a lot of army there, so I think the best thing is indeed to negotiate. And negotiate, probably the only thing which satisfies Putin and Russia will be some kind of neutrality. I don't think Russians need any territory. I don't see it. I don't hear that. Of course, this situation of Donbass might be contagious, but I don't think Russia wants to stay. But they want to make sure that they will grab as much cities as they can, and they would insist until they have some kind of government which deals with them, make sure every party brought to the discussion, and they negotiate some kind of comprehensive security for everyone. I don't think they want to turn Russia into a puppet, but they want security for themselves, or for Ukrainians, or for the whole Europe. I think that's their goal, and they are ready to achieve it at the price of bloodshed. That's why, unfortunately, but that's the way it is.
John Myrtle, President Biden here in Washington, he of course addressed the country on Tuesday night in his State of the Union address. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We have mobilized American ground forces, air squadrons, ship deployments to protect NATO countries including Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And as I've made crystal clear, the United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory that is NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. Every single inch.
I'm sorry, Alexander, I called you John there. What did you make of the president's strong support for Ukraine?
Well, he expressed strong support for NATO. He's also, of course, supported Ukraine both in the speech and elsewhere. And that's all very positive. And I think it reflects his view of the reality that, and here I disagree somewhat with Professor Goldstein. It seems to me that this really is about Ukraine. And Biden knows this, as do many of his advisors. If this were exclusively about security, then Putin would have long since realized that invading Ukraine will only lead to the consequences that President Biden outlined, namely the strengthening of NATO and the possibility, the distinct possibility that Sweden and Finland could actually join NATO. So if Putin was in fact trying to weaken NATO, if he was in fact trying to enhance Russian security, he either made an enormous blunder or he simply doesn't understand anything about geopolitics. That's hard to imagine. Far more likely, I think, is that, as Biden and others have said in the last week or two, that this is an invasion whose target is Ukraine. And Putin has made that very clear. He's emphasized over and over again that the Ukrainians are fascists, that the Ukrainians are Nazis, that the Ukrainians are engaging in genocide. These are all preposterous claims, especially in light of the fact that President Zelensky himself is of Jewish background. But he's doing this so as to create a situation which would permit him to go in and finally resolve the so-called Ukrainian question. One of his propagandists has even referred to a final solution for the Ukrainians. So as much as this apparently or seemed to be about security back in December and January, the reality is that Russia was planning this attack months before those two letters were delivered by Foreign Minister Lavrov to Washington and NATO. So the reality is that the planning was taking place, the invasion was being planned, and at the same time, this kind of diversionary tactic intended to divert Western attention from the real problem, Ukraine, to something called security in NATO was employed. Fortunately, the United States and the West didn't quite fall into that trap, and they had been warning about the possible invasion already in December and January. Now, of course, we're living with the consequences of Putin's tragic choice, because as the professor mentioned, he's likely to continue. The problem is that there's no obvious point at which he should stop, because if he creates a puppet regime, that regime will collapse within 24 hours, left on its own. Alternatively, he would need to occupy the country, and that would cost anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million troops permanently stationed in Ukraine and subject to guerrilla activity and insurgency and virtually unanimous popular hatred.
All right. Let me ask Vladimir Goldstein for his response to what you have said. Vladimir, you just heard Alexander Myrtle tell us there that this could backfire on the Russians. It could end up with NATO being strengthened by President Putin's actions. I'm also hearing a lot of references and comparisons to Hitler and Nazism here. And I'm wondering, is that fair for the Russians, seeing that they played a huge role in the Second World War in defeating Nazism?
Well, they would definitely have some kind of propaganda war on both sides. So I think this light, easy use of Nazi and Hitler, it should be abandoned, basically. You know, countries at this stage of the game, they pursue their own interest. And I somewhat agree with Professor Mattel, an idea that, you know, it can backfire. Of course it can backfire, but I suspect people there made calculations. And calculations are very clear. Russians feel very strongly about Ukraine in terms of the red line. You know, of course, there's a very legitimate argument what will happen with Sweden and Finland. We have to see whether their population will indeed decide to join and how it will work. But there was never such a strong feeling expressed, and Putin reiterated it again and again and again since 2007. So this is a very burning issue. So we can talk and condemn them and do anything they want, but this issue wouldn't go away. That's a fundamental problem. So even if we can imagine 5 resolutions of UN and Putin backs off, there will be next leader who will feel equally insecure about this part of the Europe. This is very kind of, you know, in Russian imagination.
Yeah.
That's where they get attacked. That's where they've been attacked by Germany before. And so that's unfortunate kind of geopolitical situation. So Russia, you know, we'll see whether he miscalculated or not.
All right.
I don't think it's going to be that complicated to come up with a sort of some kind of a solution where there's a neutrality.
All right, let me go to Victor Gao. Victor, what is China's view on the current situation right now? And is there a possible role for China in de-escalating this situation?
Thank you very much. First of all, allow me to express our concern and the trauma to see that war continues. Armed conflict still is raging on and resulting in civilian deaths. So we urge all parties concerned to de-escalate and do their best to bring the war to an end as soon as possible to minimize civilian loss of life. Now, you may know the Ukrainian foreign minister called the Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi just a few days ago, and the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, called Mr. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, a few days ago. And China is in touch with both Russia and Ukraine. Now, China has only one message, that is peace and negotiation to replace war, and whatever problems there were in Ukraine or between Ukraine and its main important neighbor, try to use peaceful means to resolve it. China has also mentioned that there are quite a few factors involving Ukraine which need to be dealt with separately on their own merit, and your seek or pursuit of security for one country should not be used as to constitute a threat to another country, and security in a sense is relative rather than absolute. On the other hand, China and Russia expressed their opposition to the continued expansion of NATO. And this is a very important thing because we generally believe that whatever problems there are involving the current situation involving Ukraine, the continued expansion of NATO into Ukraine is considered as a taboo by Russia. They basically expressed that over my dead body, if Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO.
Yeah.
And this fundamental security concern also need to be addressed. So China has a very important role to play. It is for peace between Russia and Ukraine.
Yulia Mendel, we talked a moment ago about the refugee crisis in Ukraine right now, and it continues to worsen. According to the United Nations, 875,000 people have fled the country, and the UN is also warning that up to 4 million people could leave the country in a short space of time. What can you tell us about the refugee crisis? I mean, how are people moving across the country? Is there any kind of infrastructure in place to accommodate them when they get to the borders?
To be frank, I have not been to the border of the country, and I'm not going to flee the country. I've heard about the numbers that you are telling now, and before the invasion started, we knew that some of our neighboring countries were already preparing shelter for Ukrainians and giving like refugee status to Ukrainians. We are supported with this by many, many countries. For you to know that, in fact, around 100,000 Ukrainians also came back to Ukraine, mostly men, because they want to defend Ukraine, I would like to underline that our Ukrainian government forbid men from 18 to 60 years old to leave the country. So right now, I know a lot of people who are standing here and fighting. A lot of people created territorial defense units, and they are all over the country. President Zelensky allowed Ukrainians to have free rifles on the first day of invasion to defend homes, and we have a lot of people standing for their towns, villages, and cities with rifles, and they're not gonna leave, definitely. So we will see how it will finish, but of course we have a lot of humanitarian aid from different countries, and we are glad for at least some time many people can find shelter, including females, elderly, and children.
Alexander Motyl, President Biden insists that United States troops are not going to be sent to Ukraine. He said that in his State of the Union speech. He's also dismissed the idea of a no-fly zone. Let's listen to what he had to say.
But let me be clear. Our forces are not engaged and will not engage in the conflict with Russian forces in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies in the event that Putin decides to keep moving west.
And we heard just a short while ago, Alexander, that the United States has sent Stinger missiles to Ukraine. But President Zelensky has appealed for more help from the United States, and it seems the kind of help that he's looking for is not forthcoming. Has President Biden actually effectively abandoned Ukraine to its own fate here?
Well, no. Remember, the United States has supplied Ukraine with several $1 million worth of weapons before the war broke out. It's still continuing to provide weapons, intelligence, information, and things of that sort. These are all very important things. And keep in mind, virtually every single European country is also providing Ukraine either with weapons or equipment of various kinds. But at the same time, it's clear that the United States does not want to engage in a war with Russia, and neither does NATO, which goes back to the point that needs to be emphasized. This is not a war about NATO's expansion. Everybody knew and everybody knows, and by everybody I mean the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, that Ukraine's chances of joining NATO anytime in the next 20 or 30 years are virtually zero. So this whole notion that Ukraine is on the verge of becoming a member, that nuclear weapons will be stationed in Ukraine, these are issues that Putin raised, are completely absurd. Because as I said, you can look at the record. The Russian policymakers.
Well, Alexander, are they completely absurd? Because the United States assured the Soviet Union at that time, in 1990, when it was falling apart, that NATO would not expand eastwards. You remember, James Baker said, not 1 inch eastwards.
Yes, but again, remember, please keep in mind the following, that Ukraine simply isn't up to NATO standards. And it's also the case that all of NATO members have to vote unanimously to accept Ukraine. And there are a whole bunch of steps that Ukraine would need to go through. Yeah. And the Ukrainians themselves have said that 40% of NATO members are against Ukrainian membership. And again, explicitly, Western policymakers, Russian policymakers, and Ukrainian policymakers have said there is no chance of Ukraine becoming a member in the next 20 or 30 years. Again, that's just the record. They're on record saying that. So for Russia to be fearful of some kind of imminent emplacement of nuclear weapons, of all things, in Ukraine, it's completely preposterous. And
so why not make that a written undertaking to Russia?
Well, because look, It would certainly have been an option on the part of Ukraine. They could have said that, but the events, as you know, tended to outrun whatever initiatives might have been able to take place. 2-3 weeks ago, the shelling in the eastern occupied territories increased. The Russians started accusing Ukrainians of being fascist Nazis and genocidal maniacs. And as you know, the plan to invade Ukraine was made at least half a year, if not more, ago. So it was Russia that was blocking on this. And the whole point being that Russia wanted to invade Ukraine. Russia wants to settle the Ukrainian question by means of a final solution. It has nothing to do with NATO.
Victor Gall, I mean, we can hear the differing viewpoints in this, and it's seemingly an intractable situation where, one side is not prepared to give the other side some kind of undertaking, and the other side saying we have security concerns. What do you think is the way out?
Exactly. I think right now the positions between Russia and Ukraine and the positions between Russia and the United States and NATO, for example, are completely irreconcilable. Someone needs to come up with flexibility. Now, I would say several things stand out. One is that no NATO membership for Ukraine at all, not only now, but maybe forever, because this is the most important thing as far as Russia is concerned. Russia has made its position before the war that no membership for Ukraine. Now they've demonstrated through war that no membership for Ukraine. They even declare that they want to achieve this goal even at the risk of a nuclear war. So no one can make this position as clear as Russia has already made. So what should be the outcome? I think the debate about NATO is really irrelevant right now. I think we need to create a situation where Ukraine can be a permanent neutral country, like a second Switzerland in Europe. Now, Ukraine may worry about its sovereignty and territorial integrity, but to be a permanent neutral state does not philosophically impinge upon your sovereignty and territorial integrity. Basically, for a country like Ukraine with very complicated relations with Russia in a very, very important, sensitive geographical position, not to become a pawn by one country against the other or vice versa will be very, very important. So rather than pouring more fuel onto the fire and encourage the Ukrainian civilians to keep fighting until the last person standing, I think we need to be realistic. We need to save as many Ukrainian people as possible. So we should avoid being deadlocked on this NATO membership. We should have the courage to go one step higher in dimension and finally achieving permanent neutral status for Ukraine.
Right. Yulia, in the 40 seconds or so that we have left, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, we heard the UN Secretary General also say it's now time for dialogue and diplomacy to get out of this crisis. I mean, doesn't it make it more urgent right now for these ceasefire talks to restart, to continue?
Achieve peace in Ukrainian territories when Russia started invasion 8 years ago. Right now, we're just praying to the world, and we are grateful that the whole world is standing behind Ukraine.
Right.
Well, we know that the United States and all European countries, all the civilized world, is together with Ukraine. So we hope to save our independence and stand for the democracy all over the world and finish this war as fast as possible.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.